Okay, so the point of this presentation is I'll give a brief introduction to ant diversity and biology generally. That'll be pretty brief, don't want to get too bogged down in that. Then we'll give a summary of ant species in Nelson, and the majority of the talk will focus on the 4 main problem species. Right, so how many species of ant are there in the world? There's actually 13,000 about described species of ants. So that's ones where scientists have actually written a formal description of the ant species. But it's estimated there's a lot more than that. So one estimate I've had recently is 22,000 species. So that's a lot of species, and of course each of these are often very abundant where they occur. So there's an estimate that if you weighed every ant on Earth, it would actually just outweigh the total human population. Now, our closest neighbour, Australia, is quite ant-rich. They've got 1,300 described species there, but the estimates is they've actually only about halfway through the number of ants there. So Australia is fairly typical of many of the continents in the globe, and the ants and termites are really important players in ecosystems. But New Zealand is an oddity. With that Gondwana land early separation, we've actually got remarkably few ant species. So we're talking about 11 native species. There's one of those, there's some DNA work is suggesting there may be 2 or 3 sibling species involved, but they're just not a major part of the New Zealand fauna. None of them reach really high abundances normally, and a lot of the work that ants do overseas is actually done by other invertebrates in New Zealand forest systems. But with the arrival of humans, we've now got more than 30 introduced species that are established here. Every year there's more and different species arrives at our ports, which are mostly exterminated, but every now and again one turns up somewhere where it's not meant to be. Nelson, we've got 9 native species have been recorded here, so there's only a couple of fairly rare ones that are missing. But there's 12 introduced species that have been recorded here, and because we're a bit colder than the rest of the country to the north, Nelson's actually the hotspot of ant diversity in the South Island. So it's more in a par with what you'll get in the northern parts of the North Island. But Auckland rules the roost there, just with a large number of introduced ones. So some of those introduced species we have established here are actually pretty marginal, and where they really dominate in Auckland areas, here they're actually scattered and really reach much of a problem status. But with forecasts with global climate change, that may actually change for this district. So for example, when we do climate modelling of an ant like the Argentine ant, we found it only takes 1 degree shift in average temperature, and that ant increases its range over most of the country. So what is the typical lifestyle of an ant? Well, you have a queen in the nest, which is the reproductive. She lays eggs, which then hatch into larvae, which are little grubs. Now, all the growing of an ant occurs as a larvae, so that's one of those sort of white blobs that you'll see the ants carry around in the nest. So they're the ones get the food, and those grubs expand. So by the time an ant is an adult, it's actually fixed in size. So an adult insect like that doesn't grow at all. So depending on how much food it gets, often as a larvae, results in the size of the adult ant at the other end. So they form pupae in the nest, and occasionally you'll see Yeah, these yellowing ones here, and those are ones which are just forming their exoskeleton under the pupal skin. And then they'll hatch out into generally one of three forms, which is either workers, which are always non-reproductive females, males, which tend to occur only sporadically in nests at certain times, and the more new season queens. And the queens and the males are both winged, and a lot of ant species, these have a mating flight, so they'll actually leave the nest, and it's the dispersal phase of the ant. So, for example, in things like red imported fire ant, which we certainly don't want here, when they have a mating flight, they'll actually go up sort of 100 metres or so in the air, mate up there, and they're actually blown over quite large distances. So now, I say this is a typical lifestyle because it's one that we're probably often taught, and it's quite a common one for many ant species, but it's by no means a template. So we have a lot of variation within that. Some ants, like the Phedoles, and we have some of those, and also they'll have a soldier caste, which is a specific type of worker with a much larger head and big mandibles, and they're mainly for defence of the trailing worker colonies. And then you have others, including one which I'll discuss here, which has other semi-reproductive stages. So although this is a basic pattern, and certainly all of them have eggs, larvae and pupae, the actual arrangement of the nest can change depending on the species.
Richard, just can I ask that you've shown they were Argentine ants.
Sorry?
They were Argentine ants.
No. No.
But you have said that Argentine ants, the queens and the males have wings, but they don't use the wings for dispersal.
That's correct, yeah. So
do they ever use them? Do Argentine ants ever use their wings to fly at all?
not as far as we know. So that's one of the reasons that they're very slow to distribute in their own way. So they're almost redundant. So the mating in those guys actually happens inside the nest. Darwin's ants is the same, but I have seen them during a mating gathering on a warm summer night actually climbing up lampposts, and I suspect that some of those may just catch a bit of wind and move a few metres across the road or something, but generally, although they've got wings, they're fairly redundant in those cases.
Their life cycle, how long does it take? I guess it would depend on the conditions as well.
Yeah, so life cycles with all insects is highly regulated by temperature. So it's like how long is a piece of string. So it can vary from a few weeks out to several months.
But in the middle of a hot summer, that cycle could be every few weeks.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, so the common ants, these are the most common ones we'll encounter. For simplicity of recognition, we've just grouped them. There's some black ones and there's some brown ones. All the common black ones, and they're really black and shiny, are actually introduced species, with the exception of the southern ant, which is quite variable. And some individuals are mostly brown, some are mostly black, yeah, that's about the only native one I can think that's actually completely black here. So a lot of them are brown, but of course the colour of an ant reflects a lot what light you're viewing it in. So we often hear people say, Argentine ants are the brown ones, but if on a bright sunny day, if you see ants trailing across a footpath, they've got a shadow, they'll appear black. So colour's not a very reliable method of actually identifying ants, so you need to look a bit closer than that. So one of the commonest ones we have in people's gardens is the garden ant, also called the parrot's ant. It was called parrot's ant because it used to be called Paratrichina, but they've recently changed to Nayland. But that's a ant that you'll encounter, when you're digging in the garden, sometimes it has fairly small nests, quite large ants. If you look close enough with a hand lens, you'll see they have erect hairs that pop out of them. The species we have here aren't too much of a problem, but there's a closely allied species which is called a crazy ant, which is a paratrichina, and that's one of the world's major pests. But these guys, if you see them on hot footpaths and things, they can run around really quite crazily. That ant is really a problem inside houses, though. So quite often we'll have people that says, oh, I've got a problem with black ants, and you ask for a sample and they can't find one inside at the moment, so they'll go in the garden, find a black ant and bring it in, but you know it's not the right one. The black house ant and the white-footed ant we'll talk about a bit later. These are the 4 native species which are relatively common in Nelson. Huberia and Prolaceus here are mostly associated with native vegetation. The southern ant is actually the most common of the native ants, so it's spread throughout the country, and it's the one native that you're likely to get frequently in your garden. The other one is more interesting, this tiny brown ant. Now you'll see that sometimes on your windowsills particularly, or in the bathroom, and they come in just a few very, very small brown ants and they forage on the insects on windowsills. Very rarely they'll get into the pantry, so they're not such a problem. Now this is, I've gone back too far. Asterisked here, this whether it's native or not, there's been a bit of debate about that. It was originally described in New Zealand, but more recently, they've been getting on top of the Australian ants, they found the same species as found in New South Wales. And I now suspect that this tiny brown ant is actually an Australian species. It's very rare. You encounter it in forest and scrub, and so its primary habitats seem to be sort of urban areas. And we go down to these guys, Argentine and Darwin's, which we'll talk about a bit later. One of the big headed ants, Fidoli, is just beginning to make its presence felt in the Nelson area with a couple of populations. That's the one that has the soldier cast. It's not the major problem of the Fidoli group. That's a thing called megacephala. But that's one to watch for the future. And the other one, quite an interesting, is the pennant ant, Tetramorium. Of the introduced ones, that and the Argentine ant are probably the only ones that aren't Australian. So the pennant ants actually come from South Africa. So it seems like the 2 main sources of introduced insects in New Zealand are Australia and then South Africa. There's a surprising amount of South African species. But for the rest of the talk, we're going to concentrate on these 4 species here, which are the main pest species which will get into your house. So the black house ant, Orchitellus, is one we probably know least about. It's an Australian species. First record is 1927, which is up in Whangarei. But by the 1940s, it was known to be quite widespread. This one nests in dry areas under stones and logs or above ground. It's quite happy in people's houses, sometimes goes in the wall cavities. It's not of these 4 species, it's the one that's least often a problem. Mostly when it does get inside, it's just in fairly small numbers, but I know Peter's recently been recording this as being more of a problem, so it may be something that as temperatures change and populations build up, that its impact may begin to be felt a bit more. So it prefers open habitats and urban gardens. It's not one we find in forests. it does venture into the edge of scrublands. The workers will forage indoors sometimes, and they'll be especially going for sweet fluid, so it's one that may get into your cordial bottles, etc. But the biology of this is quite poorly known. It's not really a major pest in Australia, the species, and so it just hasn't been studied in any great detail. Of the black ants in Nelson, this one's quite small, so it's smaller than the Argentine ants. Now, white-footed ants, Technomyrmex, it was this one is a real problem in some areas of Nelson. This is an Australian species. First New Zealand record was actually in Nelson in 1921. It was incorrectly diagnosed as being Technomyrmex albipes, which is the official white-footed ant, which is a global pest species, particularly around US and some of the Pacific Islands. But recent work has established this is actually a closely related Australian species, Chicosis. And you can't actually see white feet, so don't look at that as a diagnostic feature. Nests above ground, in trees, in wall cavities, in ceiling spaces, often in huge numbers. So this is a true arboreal species. And it'll form huge colonies that cooperate across whole neighbourhoods. So they're not quite super colonies in that you can have combative regimes on the edges. So you may have, like if you put ants from Atawai with white-footed ants from Tahuna in the same jar, they'll battle, which in the case of Argentines they don't. So there's a bit of genetic diversity going on there. But the reason these guys get into such huge numbers is they have reproductive workers, which are called intercasts. And there's actually 3 phases of that. So, and they have extra eyes on the top of their head called ocelli. And if you count the ocelli, if it's got 1, it's an early stage intercast. If it's got 2, it's a middle stage intercast. If it's a 3, it's a third stage intercast. And each of those has growing capacity to lay fertile eggs and produce more young. So these guys can quickly move into a house where they find that there's a good food source and breed up prolifically because some of the workers are actually reproductive themselves. It's a difficult one to bait for because the larvae are fed sterile eggs. So other workers are laying eggs that are non-reproductive, and they're basically like chickens, and these eggs are fed directly to the larvae. So if you feed toxic baits to this species, you don't get the same control because the adults aren't taking it back and giving it to the larvae. This one is, as I mentioned, a major household pest, and especially in the cooler months of the year. During the warmer summer months, it's often you'll find it outside, and it foraging in your lemon trees, etc., where it's taking honeydew off scale insects and aphids.
Just checking, Richard, the white-footed ant would be the biggest problem, black ant. Would that be right?
That's correct, yeah.
It's likely to have driven people a bit crazy inside their house.
Yeah, and you certainly you can form huge numbers. I had my bathroom relined in Tahuna, and when they took off the old jib board, I heard the builder curse very loudly, and I went in to see what the problem was, and it was just shimmering with black ants. It was just, must have been millions of them living inside the wall cavities of the house. Interestingly, they weren't such a problem inside the house, but being arboreal, that's where they were nesting, and during the summer they're actually going outside from there. It was only in winter that they would suddenly get up in the morning and find situations like this. So you have dishes have been let out. We went out to a concert at Nayland here actually, And when we came home that evening and turned the light on in the kitchen, this is what we discovered. And you see all the black in these old juice glasses that the kids would think were just absolutely smothered with black ants. And they just enormous numbers coming out of the wall cavities, and they just suddenly appear in your kitchen. So this one, as I say, will also forage outside on scale insects and things, so you'll often see it on your fruit trees. So on to Argentine ants. This one's native to South America, several countries in South America, but it's now widespread through the globe. New Zealand's pretty much on its southern limit in terms of its temperature tolerances. It was first found in Auckland in 1990. Decision at that point, it was quite localised, was not to do anything about it. It's now widespread throughout North Island towns and cities, plus Nelson, Marlborough and Christchurch in the South Island. It can exist. Christchurch is probably outside its real temperature tolerance, but in cities you get a lot of build-up of heat and concrete and things, and so we find some of these ants can survive quite well in cities, even though the outside country areas are too cold for it. This one's considered the second worst ant pest in the world after the red imported fire ant. Main difference being red imported fire ants can sting. These don't, although they do have a bite. Red imported fire ants are really painful. These have a multi-queen nest. They're called polygyne ants, so any given nest can have numerous queens in it, which are happily coexisting, and they'll move off and form new nests whenever there's any disturbance or cause to do so.
I read that they can have up to 8 queens per 1,000 workers. Do other ants just have a single queen per nest?
It is variable. So Darwin's ants, for example, is another one that can have multiple queens per nest. But yeah, a lot of ants only have the single queen.
So that would obviously mean that they can multiply much more readily.
Exactly, yep.
Right.
So, and these guys form huge super colonies over very large areas. And by large areas, there's some examples here. Basically they're caused because there's no genetic differences between Argentine ants within a given country, like New Zealand, for example, or a given area. There's only been one infestation that's established, or they've come repeatedly from the same source. So we suspect a lot of ours have actually come in from Australia. They have only got one genetic form there in the main area. So they're basically all sisters. So individual workers are happy to move between nests and just work cooperatively to take over a whole area. So that means that they can be incredibly dominant and repel competition for resources. And some of these super colonies are really huge. So there's one that stretches from California to Mexico. That's 1,000 kilometres, and scientists have estimated there's 1 trillion individuals. So you take ants from the south end and the north end of that, put them together, they're happy to cooperate. Southern Europe, right down across the Mediterranean side of Europe there's a super colony estimated to be 6,000 kilometres long. And the one in southern Australia that runs across the bottom of Melbourne, that 2,800 kilometres. Now, I've seen it suggested that the New Zealand North Island is also a super colony. So from the top end to the bottom, we're talking about 900 kilometres, working cooperatively. But of course, they're not everywhere. So they're in a lot of cities and things. So, but they're not in the intervening countryside. So that they're not actually working completely as a super colony. There's sort of gaps there. So the natural dispersal of these things is very slow. So as we were talking before, they don't have flight periods, and they spread by a process called budding. And I'll just run over that. So you have in winter, the ants tend to conglomerate into what are called winter aggregations. So you have a group of workers with a number of queens that are going to overwinter, and they'll set up shop somewhere where it's a bit warmer, getting a bit of sun, under warm rocks, next to warm concrete, etc. Once the weather starts warming up in spring, these queens will split off with some workers of their own and form new nests, and they may just be a few metres away, but they'll just begin to disperse out and move into areas that were inhabitable during the winter months. That processing continues over summer, so these spring dispersing ones carry larvae that will actually become new queens later in the season. And so over summer you get a massive build-up of ant nests. And then in autumn the situation reverses, so they'll actually retract back a bit into areas where they can inhabit over the...
Look at that slide, a few things occur to me. One is, it's pretty obvious then, you can see the best time of the year to try and treat the ants when they're at a low ebb, but late winter or early spring.
Yeah.
That shows up from that. But I also feel that that's diagrammatic, isn't it? And I'd imagine if you did it actually to scale, the summer growth you would have had would be much bigger than what it's showing there.
Absolutely.
It looks as though it's about 6 times the winter, but it could be many.
You're talking thousands more ants.
Yeah.
Yep. But the key to these things is that human-assisted dispersal is much faster. So the work in surveying ants around the Nelson district shows that under their natural progression, they're sort of only spreading out in one direction, maybe 2-3 properties in a year. But what you get is this human-assisted jump dispersal. So if you get a colony that includes some queens that move into a pot plant, and then somebody moves that pot plant or digs the plant out of the garden, puts it somewhere else, they've actually put in a ready-to-go propagule for these ants to start from again. Now, you see people put out rubbish bins outside, and these are often filled with Argentine ants, and we've often wondered, well, what's the risk of ants being carted off into rubbish dumps and things? But it's actually remarkably low. So we've not actually found instances of Argentine ants occurring in the landfill areas, for example, and the reason for that is that there's no queens. So although you're moving workers around, they're not able to reproduce. So it actually requires a proper nest to be carted somewhere before you're really going to get that jump dispersal. But having said that, they can actually form nests inside cars and vehicles. We've even had one in a Cessna aeroplane where the pilot had his lunch regularly and they'd moved in under the floor mat in the aeroplane. So
it might only take about 12 ants and a queen to set up, to bud off and set up so therefore, a lot of people wouldn't actually notice if the ants were in the beginning stages of setting up in a pot plant.
No, you won't in a pot plant. I think personally 12 is low. It may happen in very rare cases, but research they've done in Victoria University has shown that numbers, the Argentine ant workers actually have to be substantial numbers before they can outcompete native ants. So you have things like Monomorum antipodum, one of the southern ant. It's a much bigger ant, and they found that if it's a small nest of Argentines, that they'll actually come in there and destroy the Argentine ants. So there will be a lot of these propagules going out and being spread that don't survive, just for one reason or another. but occasionally there will be one that does manage to get through, or the nest is big enough that it's immediately competitive. So here's basically where they've been found in the sites that we're monitoring in Nelson. There's tends to be 1 or 2 new ones discovered each year. Now, I just noticed when I looked at this last night that there's actually an error in it, in those largest spots there with the most properties are actually the oldest infestations, where it's put here. So they're 6 to 8 years old rather than 3 to 5 years old, those infestations. And those times of infestation are actually estimates, because we find that these things can be established for a number of years before people really begin noticing them. So they can be there just in low numbers and just trying to get by. And it's like they reach some threshold of dominance where they overtake an area, take out the other ants, and then they become really, really noticeable.
Is it reasonable to assume that given time, that map will just be blocked in?
Absolutely. As we're saying, each year, like these infestations, like the one around Panorama Drive area, they're expanding sort of 1-2 properties in each direction per year. So as it expands out, you can imagine you're talking, 100 new properties each year, and it's an exponential growth in the number of properties infested in those. So it's going to be a growing problem, and soon some of these dots are going to join up, and because they're all genetically identical, it's just going to be one giant super colony over Nelson. So what are the impacts? Obviously they can be an extreme domestic nuisance, and Peter's already given some examples of that and probably talk some more about that as well. One of the interesting ones there is they can cause shortings of electrical fittings, both these and the white-footed ants. And what happens is the ants get in the wall cavities, and one gets fried between 2 contacts, and then another ant finds that ant and wants to eat it. So you get this pile up of dead bodies as they keep trying to harvest these electrocuted ants. And there's actually records overseas of fires starting just through ants. And I know in my place I used to have a lot of problem with light bulbs when we had white-footed ants in big numbers. And it was because they were causing these little shorts in the electrical switches. Major impact is outside when they're disrupting outdoor livings, barbecues, picnics can be overwhelmed. We had reports up north of a fairly luxurious lodge that had a conference there, and they laid out the conference food ready for the participants to come out of their meeting. When they came out half an hour later, it was just a seething mass of Argentine ants. And we heard from Peter, these ants do bite. They can be disturbing, so we have some parents that are saying their children shouldn't be playing outside anymore just because of the number of ants they're getting on them. There can be impacts on pets. Often you'll find them swarming over food bowls, and we've even got reports of lizards and caged birds being killed. But often the evidence is people suddenly come out in the morning to check on their pet, and they're presented with a skeleton in the cage. We don't actually see the death, as it were, whether the thing has died and then been consumed by ants, but it seems quite reasonable that given enough numbers that and the animal's inability to escape, that they can overwhelm and kill the animal. And some people are sensitive to the bite. I can't feel it myself, but I hear it in good authority that they can. And we've had reports of people actually moving house to escape them. So once you get that sort of thing going on, then you can start looking at, people looking at where they want to live and effects on property prices.
I don't think that's so silly, is it? Because I think the Argentine ants do have the ability of people crazy and very distressed.
Absolutely, and I've had people who've moved to Nelson from Auckland, and they've been in Auckland in an Argentine ant area, and when they came to Nelson, they were looking for a property to buy. They rang me up and said, where aren't there Argentine ants? So that was one of the major factors in where they were prepared to move. So they have impacts on horticulture as well, and mostly that's through their habit of farming sap-sucking bugs for the honeydew they produce. So things like aphids and scale insects, when they suck the sap of the tree, they actually excrete a very sweet substance called honeydew, and that's liquid gold to the ants. And in return, the bugs get some protection. So the ants will basically get rid of the predators that are trying to eat the scales and aphids. So you suddenly get a small parasitic wasp or something trying to come in to get the aphids or scale insects, and the ants will scare it off or even eat it. So, and we've also got reports that they'll actually move plant-feeding bugs to uninfested parts of the tree. So they can basically farming them. So from one, heavily infested branch, they'll move them to another branch so they can get another colony of bugs going to feed on. So once you've done that, you end up with higher populations of plant pests on the trees. And of course, a lot of these bugs will also transmit plant diseases. So though it's not been recorded, you will have that higher risk of diseases and lower numbers of beneficial insects on these plants. And the result of that is you get less healthy plants, less productivity, and if you want to do something about it, you've got more bugs on your plants, you have to use more pesticides. So that increases the costs of actually growing your crop, but it also increases the actual use of toxic chemicals. We know particularly vineyards are quite prone to these. So we know in areas of Australia where they've got Argentine ants, the vineyards there have to do 1 or 2 more pesticide cycles. Sure. So they have major impact on biodiversity, monopolising food sources and competing with native wildlife for insects and honeydew and other carbohydrate resources. They'll restructure native invertebrate communities just through predation, and it's been shown in Auckland now that they're fundamentally altering ecological processes where they're occurring. So that's even simple things like the rate of degradation of leaf litter is slower in an area with Argentine ants. You get a different community of insects trying to do the job. There's reports of them killing nestling birds. And there's a potential to increase the number of exotic sap-sucking insects on native plants and resultant risks there. Also been shown to decrease the amount of herbivory and improve the amount of seed produced on an environmental weed. In a study on bone seed, so it was actually up there and getting rid of the caterpillars and things that were eating it. And so it can also counteract biological control agents that are being released to control environmental weeds. So economic impacts, there's what we discussed before about property prices. A study in Hawke's Bay a few years back estimated that it was costing more than $3 million per annum to the horticultural in that area. And back in 2002, MAF at that stage did a bit of a study on what these things would cost and found that it was about $68 million per annum in control should the Argentine ants reach their full range.
Just have a question here, Richard.
Yeah, just before you move on to Darwin's ant, you haven't talked about where they like to nest.
Where's
Whereabouts
that?
the Argentine ants like to
They tend to be on the ground, so they love things like bark landscape gardens. They'll be really thick there, so that they're highly mobile, so they can be under rocks and in logs, up trees where you've got rotten stumps and things. They'll move there inside your rock walls. Very adaptable.
Peter covers that quite well too.
Yes. Yep. So move on to Darwin's ant. This one is native to Australia, first recorded at Auckland in 1959. Interestingly, in 1959 they misidentified it as an Argentine ant, so went in there and destroyed that colony. It's a shame they didn't do the same in 1990 when Argentine ant did arrive. It then established in Lyttelton in 1979 when big wooden sleepers were brought over to build the Lyttelton Wharf, and it was noted these were living in the wood there. They've probably arrived multiple times since then, and they've gradually spread over a large part of Christchurch now. So it's now widespread, again, urban areas, particularly around the North Island, Nelson, Marlborough, Christchurch. Like the Argentines, this thing is slow to move of its own accord. It's actually slower even than Argentine ants, but like Argentines, it's able to be spread in pot plants. And I believe it may be floating in rotting logs, because we're getting increasing reports of it established on offshore islands now. Close relative of the Argentine ant, so it was originally described in the same genus, in fact. And in Australia, it's not much of a pest at all in its homeland, and it's recorded as forming quite small nests. But in New Zealand, we know it's forming these large multi-queened nests, which are developing into mini super colonies, as it were. So it's doing similar sorts of things. So main difference is the Argentine ants are known globally as an invasive species, but Darwin's ant, it's only known from New Zealand as an invasive species. So Argentines get a lot of attention because of the global knowledge of it, whereas Darwin's here tends to be the poor cousin in pest control, and it largely because we're experiencing it for the first time. Darwin's ants are fractionally smaller. One-on-one, it can be difficult, but if you get a group of Argentines compared with a group of Darwins, the Darwins are obviously smaller. A key characteristic of Darwin's ants is their smell, and it's really quite a strong acrid smell when they're crushed or the nests are disturbed. And we have people in Nayland area here that have Darwin's ants, and there's some of those can actually smell them inside the house, so they know when they've got colonies moved in. Argentine ants tend to be in highly visible trails on top of the ground, running along surfaces. Darwin trails, however, are often much more hidden, so they'll be underneath the grass, moving underneath the leaf litter, down the crack between the concrete and the grass curbing, and they're moving along down there. So in some situations you can arrive in an area and think, oh, there's no Darwin's ants here, but if you poke around a bit, suddenly the ground will just erupt with millions of them.
It seems to me that's one of the things about Argentine ants that you can use against them, is that if you observe, you can see these trails, and you're aware of them. And so that, in a way, it's assisting us, I think. Yeah,
it can be much easier to detect. So physically, they're actually very similar to look at. There's a difficult difference to interpret on their thorax, but under a microscope, I actually find the easiest way is to look at the shape of the jaws. So the Argentines are longer than wide, whereas the Darwins are about as wide as they are long. And as you can see, these are also quite widely spread around Nelson now. There's also a substantial colony in Brightwater. There's also some now out in Tasman. And in Golden Bay as well. So these ones are beginning to move out into more rural areas, and so because of their different climate tolerances, I think these things are going to be more capable to move into a lot of the native habitats. All right, that's me done.